The violin lay shattered on the frozen ground, its strings still trembling in the winter wind. Blood had dried along the scroll, dark and permanent, like ink on parchment. Captain William Harding stood over it, his breath forming clouds in the December air of 1944, his hands shaking not from cold, but from something far deeper. He had heard the music just hours ago, a melody so pure it had silenced the guns for 3 precious minutes. Now there was only silence, the wrong kind of silence. Bastogne was dying. The Belgian town had become a graveyard dressed in snow, where American soldiers huddled in foxholes and prayed for dawn. The German advance had surrounded them completely, cutting off supplies, hope, and any dream of Christmas. Men whispered that this would be their last stand, but one man had refused to surrender to despair. One man had played music while hell rained down around them. His name was Private Daniel Ashford, and he was 23 years old when he died. William had met him only 6 weeks earlier, during the push through France after D-Day. Daniel had arrived as a replacement, stepping off a transport truck with a rifle on his shoulder and a battered violin case strapped to his back. The other soldiers had laughed. What kind of fool brings a violin to war? But Daniel had only smiled, that quiet, gentle smile that made you believe beauty could still exist in a world gone mad. "My grandfather made it," he'd told William that first night, carefully unwrapping the instrument. In a workshop in Vermont, he said music could survive anything, even silence. His fingers had traced the wood with reverence, and when he played, the entire company had fallen quiet. Mozart, Beethoven, and songs his grandmother used to hum while baking bread. For 6 weeks, Daniel's violin had been their salvation. After brutal firefights in the Ardennes forest, when men lay trembling with combat fatigue, Daniel would play, soft, aching melodies that reminded them of home, of wives and mothers, of Sunday mornings and fresh coffee. He played on the coldest nights, when frostbite threatened to claim their fingers. He played when they lost friends, giving the fallen a eulogy more sacred than words. The other soldiers had stopped mocking. They began to protect him, almost instinctively. "Keep Ashford alive," they'd say. "We need that music." As long as Daniel played, they believed they could survive. But superstition dies easily in war. The German offensive had struck with devastating precision on December 16th, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Though they didn't call it that yet. They called it chaos. Panzer tanks rolled through snow-covered hills, crushing everything. Artillery shells screamed through fog so thick you couldn't see death coming. The 101st Airborne Division was ordered to hold Bastogne at all costs, and William's company was part of that desperate stand. They'd been encircled for 3 days when Daniel had asked William a question that still echoed in the captain's mind. "Sir, if I don't make it home, will you tell them I tried to bring something beautiful into this ugliness?" William had wanted to reassure him, to say they'd all make it home, but the words had caught in his throat. He'd seen too much, lost too many, so instead, he'd nodded. A silent promise between soldiers who understood that some vows are kept only in memory. Now Daniel was gone, and the violin lay broken in the snow. William knelt beside it, his fingers brushing the splintered wood. Around him, the sounds of war continued. Distant explosions, machine gun fire, desperate shouts. But all he could hear was silence. He didn't know yet how it had happened. Only that Daniel had been in the forward observation post when the shelling started, and that someone had seen him playing even as the world exploded around him. Even at the end, he'd refused to let the music die. William lifted the broken violin carefully, cradling it like something sacred. Snow began to fall, covering the bloodstains, covering everything. In his pocket, he carried a letter Daniel had written 3 days ago, addressed to a girl named Sarah in Vermont, a girl who was waiting for music that would never come home. The war wasn't over. Bastogne wasn't saved. But something irreplaceable had been lost, and William knew that some wounds never heal. Some silences never end. 6 weeks earlier, the war had tasted like victory. November 1944, somewhere in eastern France, and the Allied forces were pushing toward Germany with relentless momentum. Hope was tangible again. Captain William Harding had led his company through the liberation of France, and though they'd lost men, too many men, the momentum felt unstoppable. Then Daniel Ashford arrived, and everything changed in the quietest way possible. William had been reviewing supply reports when Lieutenant Morrison brought the replacements in. 12 young men fresh from training, their eyes still bright with naivete. They stood in the cold drizzle, trying to look brave, trying not to notice the 1,000-yard stares of the veterans who watched them with pity. "This is Private Ashford." "Sir," Morrison had said, nodding toward a slender young man with sandy hair and striking green eyes. He's got something unusual with him. The violin case had been impossible to miss. Brown leather, scuffed from travel, strapped across Daniel's back alongside his rifle. Several soldiers had already started laughing. "Private, what exactly do you plan to do with that?" William had asked. "Play it, sir." Daniel's voice had been quiet but steady. "My grandfather made it in 1889. He survived poverty, the Spanish flu, and the Great Depression with this violin. He said music is what separates us from the darkness." I believe him. William should have ordered him to send it back. But something in Daniel's eyes had stopped him. A certainty. A kind of gentle defiance that spoke of deeper convictions than military protocol could touch. "Keep it safe, Private. This isn't a concert hall. No, sir. It's exactly why we need music." That night, after they dug in for a cold camp near the German border, Daniel had played for the first time. No one had asked him to. He'd simply taken out the violin, tuned it carefully in the firelight, and begun. Schubert's Ave Maria. The notes had drifted through the darkness like a prayer, and one by one, the hardened soldiers had fallen, silent. William had watched tears stream down the face of Sergeant McKenna, a 30-year-old from Brooklyn who'd fought since North Africa and claimed he'd forgotten how to feel. He watched Private Torres cross himself and mouth words in Spanish, his lips trembling. He watched boys become men and men become boys again, transported briefly to a world before death became ordinary. When Daniel finished, no one spoke for a long time. Then McKenna had stood, walked over to Daniel, and gripped his shoulder. "You keep that safe, kid. You keep playing." It had become ritual after that. Every third night, when circumstances allowed, Daniel would play. Sometimes classical pieces his grandmother had taught him. Bach, Vivaldi, Brahms. Sometimes folk songs that made the southern boys homesick for tobacco fields, and the northern boys nostalgic for snow-covered streets. Sometimes original melodies that seemed to come from nowhere, as if the war itself was being translated into sound. Daniel was from Burlington, Vermont, a small town where everyone knew everyone, where maple syrup season was sacred and winters lasted half the year. His grandfather, Johann Ashford, had immigrated from Sweden in 1885, bringing nothing but woodworking tools and a dream. He'd built violins in a tiny workshop, each instrument crafted with obsessive precision. "Grandpa Johann died when I was 15, Daniel had told William one night. "He gave me this violin the day before, made me promise I'd never let silence win." He'd lived through so much: famine, disease, war, loss. But he said music was the only thing that proved we were more than just animals surviving. It proved we could create beauty, even when surrounded by ugliness. Daniel had a girl back home, Sarah Mitchell, a school teacher with auburn hair, and a laugh that Daniel described like it was sacred. They'd known each other since childhood, grown up in houses separated only by a white picket fence. She taught music to elementary school children, and Daniel had promised to play with her students when he returned. They'd planned to marry in the spring of 1945. "She made me promise to come home," Daniel had said quietly. "But she also made me promise not to lose myself trying. She said if I stopped believing in beauty, the war would have won even if I survived." The violin became a symbol, something the men protected fiercely. They'd adjust patrol routes to ensure Daniel stayed safer. They'd volunteer for dangerous assignments to keep him off them. "Keep Ashford playing," they'd say. "The music keeps us human." The first time Daniel had played during combat was in early December. They'd been pinned down by German machine gun fire in a frozen forest. Men were screaming, dying, and panic was setting in. Daniel, crouched in a foxhole beside William, had suddenly pulled out his violin. "What are you doing?" William had shouted over the gunfire, "Remembering who we are, sir," and he'd played. Right there, in the middle of chaos. It shouldn't have mattered, but somehow, impossibly, the music had steadied them, given them courage. They'd pushed forward and taken the position. Later, McKenna had said it plainly. "That kid's got magic in those fingers. As long as he plays, we'll make it home." They'd believed it. They'd needed to believe it. The music had kept them alive through November, but December brought a different kind of war, the kind that breaks men from the inside out. The weather turned savage first. Snowstorms swept across the Ardennes forest with merciless intensity, transforming the landscape into a frozen hell. Temperatures plummeted below zero. Frostbite became as dangerous as bullets. Men lost toes, fingers, and sometimes the will to keep fighting. The cold was a living enemy, patient and cruel. Supply lines grew unreliable. Hot food became memory. Coffee froze in canteens before it could be drunk. Ammunition had to be rationed. Medical supplies ran dangerously low. The company that had tasted victory in November now faced the grinding reality of winter warfare. a slow, brutal erosion of body and spirit. Daniel still played, but the music changed. It became darker, more melancholic. The cheerful folk songs disappeared, replaced by haunting requiems that seemed to mourn something not yet lost. William noticed the change, but said nothing. They were all changing. War was reshaping them into shadows of who they'd been. On December 10th, they lost Private Torres during a routine patrol. A sniper's bullet, quick and efficient. He'd been 19 years old, engaged to a girl in Texas. Daniel had played at the makeshift funeral, standing in the snow with frost forming on the violin strings, playing a Spanish lullaby Torres's mother used to sing. Sergeant McKenna had wept openly. No one looked away. How many more? Daniel had asked William that night, his voice hollow. How many more songs do I have to play for the dead? As many as it takes to keep the living going, William had answered, hating himself for the words. Your music matters, Daniel. Maybe more than you know. But the truth was, William wasn't sure anymore. He'd watched Daniel's hands begin to shake when he played, watched the light in his green eyes dim with each lost friend. The violin was supposed to protect him, to keep him connected to beauty and hope. Instead, it was becoming a burden. The weight of carrying beauty through a world designed for destruction. The German offensive began on December 16th with an artillery barrage that sounded like the earth splitting open. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last desperate gamble of a dying Reich. Panzer divisions punched through American lines with shocking ferocity, exploiting the weakest points, driving deep into Allied territory. William's company was caught in the chaos, part of the 101st Airborne ordered to hold Bastogne. If Bastogne fell, the entire Allied advance would collapse. They were ordered to hold at all costs. No retreat, no surrender. The encirclement happened within 48 hours. German forces surrounded Bastogne completely, cutting off all roads, all supplies, all hope of reinforcement. They were alone, outnumbered 5-1, facing battle-hardened SS divisions with orders to take the town before Christmas. The shelling became constant. Day and night, German artillery pounded their positions. Buildings collapsed. Foxholes became graves. The wounded screamed in makeshift aid stations. Medics worked until they collapsed. There was never enough morphine, never enough bandages, never enough time. Daniel stopped playing for 3 days. His violin stayed in its case, wrapped and silent, while men died around him. William watched him withdraw into himself, becoming hollow-eyed and distant. On the third night of the siege, Sergeant McKenna found Daniel sitting alone in a bombed-out cellar, holding the unopened violin case, tears streaming down his face. I can't, Daniel whispered. I can't play anymore. Every time I do, someone dies. Every melody becomes a funeral. I'm cursed, Sergeant. McKenna had sat beside him, this hardened soldier who'd killed dozens and felt nothing, and spoke with surprising gentleness. Kid, you're not cursed. You're human. We all break eventually. But here's what I know. You've kept us sane when sanity was impossible. You've reminded us why we're fighting. Not for territory or politics, but for the world where music can exist. If you stop now, they win. Not the Germans. The darkness. That night, Daniel had played again. Not soaring classical pieces or cheerful folk songs, but something raw and aching. A melody that sounded like grief given voice, like hope bleeding out slowly. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was honest. And honesty, in that moment, was more powerful than beauty. The men had listened in silence, many crying openly. They were all breaking together, and somehow that made it bearable. On December 22nd, a German delegation arrived with a surrender ultimatum. The acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, responded with a single word: nuts. The soldiers in the foxholes had laughed, bitter, exhausted laughter that held more desperation than joy. Daniel had played that night in the town square while soldiers gathered. He played America the Beautiful, slowly, mournfully, transforming the patriotic anthem into an elegy. And for the first time, William understood what Daniel's grandfather had meant. Music didn't prove they could survive. It proved they'd lived. But creation demands sacrifice, and December wasn't finished taking from them. The heaviest shelling came on December 23rd. German forces launched a coordinated assault on 3 sides of Bastogne, determined to break through before reinforcements could arrive. The forward observation posts took the brunt of the bombardment, artillery shells, rockets, and mortar fire creating a wall of death. Daniel had been assigned to the forward position that morning. William had tried to reassign him, but Daniel had refused. I've been protected long enough, sir. Other men have died while I played. Let me carry my share. The assault had begun at dawn. The shelling started as a distant rumble, then escalated into a thunderous roar. William had been in the command post when the bombardment began. He'd known immediately that the forward posts would be hit hardest. He'd known Daniel was there. The German assault was methodical and overwhelming. Tiger tanks rolled forward under cover of artillery. Infantry advanced in waves. Machine gun fire raked across defensive positions. Bastogne was dying by inches. William had grabbed his rifle and rushed toward the forward positions, against protocol, against logic, but compelled by something he couldn't name. Around him, soldiers were fighting desperately. The air smelled of cordite, blood, and burning diesel. The snow had turned black with ash and red with blood. That's when he heard it. Above the chaos, impossibly clear, a violin was playing. At first, William thought he was hallucinating, but other soldiers heard it too. They looked up, confused, searching for the source. The melody was hauntingly beautiful. Beethoven, played with heartbreaking intensity. It was coming from the forward observation post. William had run toward it, dodging explosions, his heart pounding. Sergeant McKenna appeared beside him, also running, both drawn toward the music like sailors toward a deadly shore. The observation post was a ruined building, half collapsed from previous shelling. Smoke poured from shattered windows, and standing in the doorway, completely exposed, was Daniel Ashford. He was playing his violin while the world exploded around him. His face was streaked with dirt and blood. His uniform was torn, but his hands were steady on the instrument, drawing out notes that seemed to defy the violence surrounding them. His eyes were closed, and on his face was an expression of perfect peace, as if he'd transcended the battle, as if music had carried him to a place where bombs couldn't reach. "Daniel!" William screamed, but his voice was lost in the bombardment. German soldiers were advancing. A tank was turning its turret in their direction. Shells were falling closer. Daniel was going to die, and he was playing as if death was an audience to be serenaded. McKenna had grabbed William's arm. "We have to pull him out!" They'd sprinted toward the building, firing at advancing Germans, throwing themselves across open ground. Other soldiers had seen them and provided covering fire, desperate to reach the man whose music had sustained them. William reached Daniel first. He grabbed his shoulder, shouting, "Daniel, we have to move!" Now, Daniel's eyes opened slowly. He looked at William with a strange, calm expression. "I'm not afraid anymore, sir. The music showed me something. We don't survive by outlasting death. We survive by creating something death can't touch. That's profound, Private. But you'll be dead if we don't move." A shell had exploded 15 yards away, throwing them both to the ground. William's ears rang. His vision swam. He looked up to see the German tank taking final aim, its cannon pointed directly at their position. There was no time to run. Daniel had stood up, still holding the violin. He looked at the tank, at William, at McKenna, and smiled. "Take care of Sarah for me," he'd said quietly. "Tell her I played until the end." Then he raised the violin and began playing Amazing Grace. The sound was transcendent. It rose above the gunfire, above the explosions, above the screams. For 3 impossible minutes, soldiers on both sides had stopped fighting. Germans lowered their weapons. Americans stood in their foxholes listening. The tank crew held their fire. It was as if Daniel's music had reminded them all that they were human beings who'd once known peace. William had tried to pull him to safety, but Daniel had shaken his head, still playing. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, but his hands never faltered. The notes were perfect, crystalline, beautiful beyond words. The moment broke when a German officer shouted orders. The tank fired. Everything happened in fragments. The explosion, the shockwave throwing William backward, the building collapsing, McKenna screaming, the violin flying through the air, still making sound until it hit the ground and shattered. And silence. When the smoke cleared, William had crawled forward. Daniel lay beneath the rubble, the violin beside him, both broken beyond repair. His eyes were closed, and on his face was that same expression of peace. McKenna had pulled William away as German forces retreated. They'd dragged Daniel's body back to their lines, William clutching the shattered violin. Around them, soldiers stood in shocked silence, a man who'd chosen beauty over survival, music over safety. That night, the clouds had finally broken. American air support arrived. Patton's Third Army began breaking through German lines. The tide was turning. They would survive, but Daniel Ashford wouldn't see it. The war ended 5 months later, but for William Harding, part of the war never ended. He survived Bastogne. He survived the push into Germany. He survived VE Day in May 1945. He came home with medals, commendations, and the shattered violin he'd carried through the final months of combat, wrapped carefully in cloth, protected like something sacred. But he couldn't survive the promise he'd made. Burlington, Vermont in July 1945, was exactly as Daniel had described it. White church steeples rising above maple trees, rolling green hills dotted with farms. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the war had taken sons and brothers, where mourning was woven into daily life. Sarah Mitchell lived in a yellow house with blue shutters. She was 22 years old, and when she opened the door, William understood immediately why Daniel had talked about her laugh like it was sacred, even in grief, and he could see grief in her red-rimmed eyes. She possessed a gentle strength that reminded him of Daniel himself. "Miss Mitchell?" William had said. "My name is Captain William Harding. I served with Daniel. He asked me to bring you something." She'd invited him inside, her hands trembling as she poured tea neither of them would drink. The house was filled with photographs. Daniel as a child, Daniel at graduation, Daniel in uniform. On the mantel sat a violin bow, displayed like an heirloom, waiting for an instrument that would never return. William had placed the case on the table between them. "I need to tell you what happened. The truth." For 2 hours, he'd told her everything. About Daniel's arrival with the violin, about how the music had sustained them, about the siege and the final stand. He told her about the 3 minutes when the battle stopped, when soldiers on both sides remembered they were human. He told her Daniel had played Amazing Grace at the end, that his last words had been about her. Sarah had cried silently, tears streaming down her face, but she never looked away. When William finished, she'd reached out and touched the broken violin with reverence. "He wrote me," she said softly. The last letter arrived 3 days ago. She'd retrieved it, letting William read Daniel's careful handwriting. "Dearest Sarah, I don't know if I'll make it home, but I need you to know, the violin saved me. Not my life, but my soul. It kept me human when humanity seemed impossible. If I don't return, don't mourn the music. It never truly dies. Every song I played became part of the world. Play for the children, Sarah. Teach them that music matters. I love you. I always will." William had wept reading it. Sarah had held his hand, both mourning a person who'd made them believe the world could be better. "What do we do now?" Sarah had asked. "How do we honor him? We remember. We tell his story. We make sure people understand that he didn't die for territory. He died proving that some things are worth protecting even when you can't hold them. Things like beauty, art, the human spirit itself." Together, they'd created a memorial, the Ashford Music Education Fund, dedicated to providing instruments and lessons to children who couldn't afford them. The broken violin was displayed in Burlington's Veterans Memorial, alongside Daniel's story. Sarah became a music teacher, telling every class about the soldier who played violin during the Battle of the Bulge. William visited every year on December 23rd, the anniversary of Daniel's death. He'd stand at the memorial, looking at the shattered violin, and remember the 3 minutes when the world stopped killing and started listening. Decades passed. William grew old. Sarah married a music professor who'd heard Daniel's story. They had children who learned violin, grandchildren who visited the memorial and asked questions. William died peacefully in 1994, 50 years after Bastogne. At his funeral, they played Amazing Grace on violin. Johann's legacy continued. Every note was an echo of Daniel's final song. The memorial still stands in Burlington. The broken violin rests in its case, strings forever silent. But visitors leave flowers every December 23rd. Music students visit before recitals. Veterans come to remember. Grandparents bring grandchildren and tell them about the soldier who played while the world exploded. Daniel Ashford played his last song on December 23rd, 1944. But the music never stopped. It echoes in every instrument given to a child who can't afford one, in every student who learns that art matters, in every person who chooses beauty over bitterness, creation over destruction. His music didn't die with him. It multiplied. And that, perhaps, is the only victory that truly matters. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone about the soldier who carried a violin into war. Teach a child that beauty is worth protecting. Play music, create art, choose hope. Because Daniel Ashford believed we're capable of more than just survival. And he died proving it. Remember his name. Remember his music. Let the music survive.